The Old School is brought to you by Ahart Solutions, which provides school surveys and applied research. More information at ahartsolutions.com. And good afternoon.
Yes.
It is afternoon. Welcome to the Old School Podcast, a podcast about the American education system and sundry, but also a host of many other things, including literature. And then with me in this endeavor is my good friend, Dr. Stephen Bourgeois. Good afternoon, Dr. Bourgeois.
Hermilda, this is 2 episodes in a row, is it, that we're doing it in person?
Yeah, don't listeners get comfortable with this. I mean, this may not last, but
Yeah, it's a little bit awkward because we never talk, you and I.
never.
And we never see each other unless there's a football game on or something, which is about every other day.
I do have some news regarding football.
Oh,
And we may be doing, or I may be doing this podcast from Liverpool in about 2 months. I'm present right now. I'm trying to get tickets to see Everton. This is their last year in their stadium that they've been in since 1890. And so I'm trying to figure out who all has contacts in England. But right now, working on the angles of getting tickets. But I think the plane tickets are about to be bought this week. And so it looks like we're going to have an episode soon where I will be once more in a foreign port of call.
well, I'm really excited for you here, Miller. And I think you should introduce our guest because he'll be more excited than I am. I have a feeling.
He is now a professor at the University of Dallas. It is Dr. Paul Weinhold. Good afternoon, Dr. Weinhold.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. So glad to be here with you guys again.
Yes, it's fun. It's fun. Had a good time last time.
Well, have we had 1 or 2 sessions?
I think I talked with y'all about Shakespeare once, and that's it. Yeah.
There's the Lost episode.
The Lost episode.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's the point of having a conversation at all if it's not recorded?
Yeah. You hit record on this, right, Steve?
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
right.
Okay. Okay.
But if you don't hit record, there's no voice to remind you or yell at you. And so it's sort of, post-mortem, record.
But anyway, so
Yeah, well, welcome back for sure. And we always talk about having you on any time, but our schedules or yours it's been a year, I mean, a crazy year.
Yeah, it's been particularly crazy for me over the last, I'd say, 6 months with moving out here to the Dallas-Fort Worth area from Phoenix. And so, yeah, if anyone listening to this is in the market for a home in Phoenix, then, maybe we'll put some links down in the description. You can check out our Zillow listing.
Realtor.com. Just put it in. We take all kinds of links down there.
Yeah.
we have no idea what we would do. So it's fun. So, well, welcome to the DFW area. Welcome to North Texas. And for those listening, if you've not had a chance to listen to the previous episode, it was a great episode about Shakespeare, about whom Paul has a particular set of skills and knowledge with regards to. And so, and this time around, we're going to stick with the literary vein, and we're going to deal with literary influences.
Literary influences.
Yes.
Of us personally.
Of us personally.
I'm kind of distracted right now because you have the no technology. Your cell phone is like blowing up. Every once in a while, I see a text like every 10 seconds. What's going on? You actually use social media. Is that what's happening?
No, it's not social media. It's a text. Text is not social media.
Okay. Well,
Didn't someone have a conversation about that?
We're trying to talk about Shakespeare or literature in general. And you distract us with technology.
Half of my house is in shambles right now through renovation.
Isn't that a part of U.S. history?
Yeah. So sorry, it was the U.S. history side of me that kind of got confused there. But no, so I got my contractor that keeps chiming in. Luckily, I do have a partner in this life, and she's fielding most of these calls.
Oh, it's a group text.
It's a group text.
I've banned group texts. I never participate. I just delete everybody involved forever. I hate that.
I thought you were phone free. Didn't you tell me you were phone free these days, Steve?
We have no, well, we eliminated all of our apps, but the two or three or four or five or six essential, but we have
Okay.
a browser on our, or we've hidden it so we don't use it, both of us.
Yes.
Oh,
Um,
both of y'all.
yeah, so if you say something erudite and we don't know what you're talking about, which is likely to happen, we can't just get out our phone and, ask Jeeves or whatever you do.
Of course, you do have like 50 screens up here in this little command
Be
center.
quiet. This is they don't. The internet doesn't work there either.
Feels like I'm in NORAD or something, or some sort of top secret government facility.
So I feel like those students in class who have distracted the teacher to the point where he or she has forgotten what we're talking about today.
But no, the idea is that all three of us
Mhm.
are readers. All three of us have a deep value and love for books. And so it makes sense that, first of all, that this love would have not started recently, but rather would have been something that would have been with us the entire time. And as it often happens, what we read in the beginning can be an influence, not just on what we read in the future, but also in how we carry ourselves, how we develop as a person. And so the idea was what it would be like to have a conversation with regards to literary influences. And who better to have that conversation with than with Paul?
Someone who has likely read more than both of us together, I would imagine.
I
Though,
highly doubt that.
well, well,
I think you were
or
being
are we kidding? But he probably had an earlier start,
yeah,
because my story will be embarrassing for the lack of,
like in your 20s or something. What are we talking
well,
about?
that's you need to frame this because I initially thought you were talking about elementary through high school, but I know what period of life are we referencing?
We're talking about the nascent stages of your reading. So if it happened to be in your 20s, then that's where it is. If it happens to be with more erudite individuals such as
Okay.
Paul and myself,
Oh,
maybe it's a little bit earlier, so
okay. Well, launch into it because I don't know where this is going. I feel like I'm going to come out on the short end though.
well, we could get just kind of do a round topic as far as like one each, and then I'd had the idea of two, in mind,
Hmm.
and we could just kind of do like a round robin. If you want to start with me,
Yeah, you seem
or
to want to
let's
start.
start with Paul.
No,
Then he's the guest, so
Well, I wanted to mention something that was in the news recently. I think it was in the Atlantic. There was an article titled "The Elite College Students Who Don't Read Books." Have you guys seen this?
I have not.
I can imagine though.
Yeah, well, yeah, I can too. Man.
Yeah. So it was written by a Columbia professor who describes the woes of teaching a freshman level course at Columbia and discovering to his chagrin that the students in his courses no longer actually know how to read books, meaning they're really bright and intelligent, good, well-meaning students, but they just increasingly found it incredibly challenging to finish the assignments that he had been giving for decades, to students, and those students didn't have any problem with it. And so the challenge he discovered was that they actually weren't being assigned to read whole books in high school. And so they were able to get away with reading just excerpts throughout their whole high school career in their English classes and history classes and elsewhere, because that's how they're tested. And so if you're teaching to the test, then you tend to assign excerpts rather than whole texts. And so again, these are bright kids who just don't have any practice in what it means to read 200 or 300 pages at a time for like a class in a week, and so that may be one way to frame this conversation in light of, modern educational practices and what we're seeing happening in the culture today. It's likely that our experience is not anything like the experience of the students who are in classrooms today. And that's something I think may be worth talking about.
Well, I might be in that group. I'm going to give you one little anecdote of my high school years. We were assigned The Grapes of Wrath, and that's a sizable book. And back in the, what was that, in the late 70s, they assigned that, and we were expected to read it. And I didn't jump at the challenge. I was into athletics and all kinds of things, music, but the idea of taking that much time, and it just didn't stick. But we had to do a test on that, actually a paper. That's what it was, a paper on the book. And so I essentially took an excerpt, a scene where some driver swerved, one to avoid a turtle, another actually intentionally ran over a turtle. And I framed that as a metaphor for the entire book, went into great detail, and got away with it. Hadn't read anything, just looked for something I could hang my hat on. It was due the next morning. And
Cliff Notes.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
between the book and the quick
Yeah.
notes, yeah, they had them back then.
Yeah.
But I was resistant in high school. So I'm not the one to cast stones, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that could be a fine technique, right? If you, assuming you had read the whole book, to take a particular moment in it and write about it.
Yeah,
That seems like good literary analysis to me,
right.
because you're relating part of the text or part of the story to the whole of the story.
Yeah.
It's just hard to do that if you don't know what the whole is, right?
Well, that it didn't work in college, I can assure you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for you, what would you say is either a character or an author or something of a literary nature that was an early influence for you?
So I'll tell you about one experience that I had where, for whatever reason in school, I was in 10th grade, we had like 2 or 3 study halls in a row for some reason. It was one of those days where a teacher was out or something was funky with the schedule or something like that. And I went to a classical high school. So we had Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as our assigned reading. And I knew it was coming up, and we were assigned to read it over, I don't know how long, a week or two. But I had all these study halls stacked up. And so I just read the entire thing like all at once. And that was the first time I had read anything of any sort of length. It's not a super long poem, but um I was able to take it all in. And it was the kind of story that was really compelling to me at a young age. Um it starts out with this horseman riding into the Knights of the Round Table and um asking one of the knights to chop his head off, and then he chops his head off, and then he holds up his own head and he's like, I'll see you in a year, because the because the deal is that now Gawain has to allow the Green Knight to let him take a strike at his neck. And so that was odd and strange to me. And I thought, what sort of story is this? And then there are these scenes where there's a lady of the house who's like sitting on Gawain's bed and talking with him. And it's very sort of, erotic in a way. And I just, I was a teenage boy. I was like, what sort of story is this? And, and, but ultimately it's a poem that is incredibly just like deep and meaningful and full of messages of honor and piety and um keeping one's word and um living with the realization of a fault in your past, but then also being upfront with that. And so I don't know, it was just such a important moment for me as a reader to realize that I could do that and that I could ingest a whole book that way. um and I really fell in love with reading um even more as a result of doing that. A second, you didn't ask for two, but I'm going to give you two. Two. Just a second one was, I can't remember how old I was, but I reread The Scarlet Letter. I think so often we talk about reading, but we rarely get opportunities to reread a text, and I reread the Scarlet Letter, and I realized that it wasn't, there's all this foreshadowing in that story, right? And so uh, I realized that it wasn't that Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote chapter one, finished it, and thought to himself, "What am I going to write next?" which is which is what I had thought that writing a novel was about, or how the author did it, and instead it was he had an idea of the whole and how all the parts fit together, and put that together from the beginning. So I think rereading is also a really important experience that, I would hope everybody has the chance to do that at some point, to visit a text again when you're maybe a little older, maybe a little wiser, uh, just more familiar with the story, so you notice more details.
I think with certain literature, it's not unlike history, where sometimes it could be a slow burn, and what you are capable of appreciating as a teenager or younger cannot match what you might be able to appreciate later. So, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are perhaps not inclined to revisit, especially if it was something that they were forced to read, like in the context of an English class or what have you. That becomes something that prevents them from doing it again later in the future. But um, the context is different, the goals are different, the motivation is different, and so therefore, what you get out of it presumably will also be different.
So what about you here, Miller? Where did you start with your love of reading?
So there's two things that come to mind immediately, and those who know me know that I have a certain level of an ability of observation, and sometimes especially when I was younger, my willingness to share my observations were sometimes ill-timed and perhaps better left unsaid. But as you get older, you learn to censor yourself a little bit. But I notice everything, and part of that comes from reading Sherlock Holmes. When I was a kid, I got into Sherlock Holmes and I read all the books, and this was at a time when my first exposure to him on television or film was Basil Rathbone. That was the guy who's probably most associated with him in film, like in the 30s or 40s. But it was the PBS thing with Jeremy Brett of the 80s where I first kind of really started to connect with him. But in the books, a lot has been said about the books and how the books kind of represent a beginning in forensic science and how people look at crime, how people look at a crime scene. And certainly it is shocking when you read the books how much of it predicted. But for me, it was just this notion that what the character taught me was that there was a whole world that previously I was not paying attention to. And there was a whole world of things taking place that others, for various reasons, didn't see. And so, in the way that sometimes books or television or film might influence a young person, I began to kind of mimic the qualities as much as I could, the qualities of Sherlock Holmes, as far as like looking around and purposely trying to see what I might have been previously blind to or not interested in, you know? And that creates another idea, the fact that everything is interesting. It just depends on how you look at it. And I think part of that comes from those books. And so those books have been, a lot of people know about the books. A lot of people know about the big stories, the story of Pink and Game of Four, whatever. The but the idea behind the books has to do with simply, for me, what I got out of it is simply by being aware of what was happening. And and so in that sense, I would say that that was probably a huge influence.
I think you had a second one that you had mentioned before.
Well, the second one was Louis L'Amour.
That's right.
So Louis L'Amour, for those who don't know, he was perhaps best known for writing cowboy stories, and a lot of people think about him. They think about Zane Grey or what have you. These individuals that are kind of known for these settings, and for me, it was the idea. This is where I first became fascinated with the desert when I first moved to Texas, my first inclination is I wanted to go to El Paso because it was in the Marty Robbins song. It was surrounded by desert. There was a lot of this kind of romantic imagery that surrounded El Paso for me. And part of it comes from what I had connected to with the desert and with communities out west through these Louis L'Amour books. Part of it was also the idea of how a man carries himself. Now, some would suggest that trying to mirror yourself after a cocaine-addled detective from England and a lonesome cowboy staring at cows all day may not be the best recipe for a great adult. but the idea was is that as far as I think the cowboy is a exercise in stoicism, and then the notion of how you react to things, how you respond to things when you're constantly surrounded by something that's bigger than you are. It is hard to get worked up by individual moments in time just because you're used to seeing a kind of a grander picture, whether it's out in the wilderness, out in the frontier, out in the desert. And so for me, this idea of solitude and I think this idea of observation are two qualities that I picked up from these two authors and these two characters through the early years of my formation.
So these actually shape the future of who you become, in a different way than say individuals, mentors.
We've both talked about the fact that both you and I get our energy from solitude, that there's something about solitude. And Paul, I don't know how you relate to this. Maybe your energies come from different places, but for me, my energy comes from being alone. And certainly I must have been wired that way to a certain point, but I think it's also one of the reasons why I connected to Louis L'Amour books, because it featured these people that existed within this lack of surroundings, as it were. And so for me, it was something that I gravitated towards. What do you think, Paul? I mean, do you think that, how would you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm similar to you in that I don't know how much you need solitude, but I do get a lot of energy from that.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of a what they would call an ambivert, you know.
Okay.
I like to bounce back and forth between social and situations of solitude,
Yeah.
which makes my profession pretty perfectly
Right.
adapted to my personality, really, because I get to do both of those things. So
Mhm.
that's pretty fun. Yeah.
What about you?
As far as what my
Early
personality.
literary
Oh,
influences, or if you want to get into the personality
no,
aspect,
we know my personality too well, I think.
we all
My,
know this personality.
um, I think that there was a transition because when I was, I guess, late in high school, I think that was the first time I read something by choice because everything was assigned. You're just trying to keep ahead of it. But um, so my best friend was reading Hermann Hesse, and the book was Siddhartha, or as the Germans would say, Siddhartha. And so he read it. It made a big impact on him, and I immediately found the book and read it, and we talked all about it, and it seemed to bridge, Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, but also this German sensibility. So it was kind of a strange combination, but it worked for me. So it's one of the first things that really got me thinking philosophically. And at that point, I do what I always do, which is dig in, take things a little bit farther, and then a lot farther. So I started reading everything that Hesse wrote, and that was probably the summer after high school, through early college, my first bachelor's. But I worked through everything, and the book that made the most impact was Steppenwolf, and very dark. A story of a man who is essentially suicidal and gives himself a pact that on his 50th birthday he has the right to take his own life, and then uh, he works his way out of it with some very strange modern uh, experiences, and so a lot of it felt like it was written on acid, actually. But it's the kind of thing like um, where like Paul was saying that I reread and reread and then I used it to really learn German. I mean, I had taken 3 years of German in high school. Eventually, I became a German major, but that book I wanted to read it in German. And so, if you see my original copy, it's up there someplace. There are a lot of words underlined, and that was my methodology. I would read and underline everything I didn't know. It was a lot. Then I would go to a good old-fashioned dictionary and I'd write it just above the word, but then I'd make this master list, and start studying them. So that was the book that got me going, and I think it really did shape kind of this pessimistic Germanic philosophy. It connected me to the work of Nietzsche, who was an incredible influence on Hesse. So I think the love of philosophy and kind of this dark worldview, came out of that, and it was really a chance experience. Maybe I had this predisposition to darkness anyway, but that captured it, and it's still one of the things. I'll reread Hesse every year.
George Will said he became depressed by being a Cubs fan. You went across the pond to Nietzsche,
Yes,
and that's what made you a pessimistic personality.
I should have been a German.
It's interesting to think about the ways that books or authors find us. Like Steve, you were talking about how these were books that you were not assigned,
Right.
and that in some ways makes all the difference. Um, and sometimes we encounter books that, um, they're in some ways dangerous to us, or they're books we ought not to be reading, or something like that, and that only makes us want to read them all the more. And there's an element of that could be used, by the teacher in a healthy way, I think. Um, I bought my son, who is 10, I think when he was 8, I got him a book called The Dangerous Book for Boys. Have you guys heard of this?
No, and I love the title.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great title, and it's really well bound and looks like an old-timey book on the outside. And on the inside, it's just all these different articles. It reminds me a lot of like the old encyclopedias that we had in our schoolrooms, like before the internet. And you can kind of go through it, and it has all sorts of things like how to make a paper airplane, and what the different insignia for military insignia mean. And there was this one article about I believe it was a World War II pilot who lost a leg with the Royal Air Force, and who still nonetheless flew a plane and like shot down Germans, and like stories of heroism. And it's just various and sundry things that would seem awesome to boys, and just that title of like, this is dangerous, probably shouldn't do it,
Yeah.
is going to entice them to read it. Um, so I don't know, that there's just, I like that idea of books or texts like finding us, and that match, whether it happens early in life or later in life. There's just something really beautiful when we get that right,
As a parent, you're aware of that because, or well, you become aware of it because in your effort to try to curate a love of reading, you try to introduce certain things to your kid. My big brain idea was to introduce my daughter to Laura Wilder, the Little House on the Prairie series.
Mhm.
And she got about 20 pages in, and she had asked me like 50 questions about what is this, what is that, and it was just the language of the book is so removed from the reality of my daughter's life that it was not something that she could connect with. Now, maybe later on down the road, when she's older, maybe she'll be able to connect with it, but that's the problem when you try to engineer the love. She has a love of books, and so thankfully I don't have to worry about that. But as far as like what they gravitate towards, you just don't know. But as Paul, as you said, that book and child or book and adult will find one another at some point, and
Mhm.
so and then it probably won't be about Laura Wilder and
No.
the Little House on the Prairie, but um it'll be something, and hopefully it'll be just as rewarding for her as Sherlock Holmes or Louis L'Amour books were for me.
So something highly personal and maybe subversive in a way. I mean, there's the cliche about reading a book under, the covers with a light on, a flashlight or something. But I think that, if somebody picks it, I do love the idea of a book finding you. And, and going back to what you said about the undergraduate students not reading, I think that maybe they weren't given that opportunity. They were assigned book after book after book, and it shut down that inclination. And so none of those books found them for probably a lot of good reasons. And they didn't continue to find anything on their own.
Yeah, it can happen through serendipity so beautifully, right? This is why libraries are so important, and bookstores, where you're just scanning the shelves, and a title jumps out at you, and you know, you read it and or start reading it, and it grabs your attention or something like that. But I will say, I mean, so at the University of Dallas, the undergraduates do read a lot of books. There are, I think it's 73 credit hours, our core credit hours in our program.
Wow.
And I think that's right. And there are just a ton of assigned readings. And I think there's actually a virtue in that too, right? That there are, we do want to, develop people who are readers who encounter things on their own. But we also believe that there are certain, I suppose, central core experiences that we want our students to have, so that they have a kind of fundamental basis for having a conversation. And so that they have kind of anchor points for the reading that they'll do throughout their life. So, having read some of the great epics and tragedies and novels of the Western tradition, they're able to go on and read other things, or to reread those over and over again. I mean, they really do withstand multiple readings, obviously. And so, yeah, I think there's something of a balance there that needs to be struck between requiring readings and also giving students the free play to choose things on their own.
And we may be leaning on the free play idea a little bit more now. I know they have some choices in high school what they read, but you always lose something. There's really not a shared canon when students get into becoming an undergraduate. They don't necessarily have anything that they've all read. So you're doing quite a service by assigning these great works. My theory about the lack of reading by undergraduates and even ability to read is that they've lost some of the decoding skills. It's a type of thing where you would lose it for more complex texts and lengthier ones. There's a tendency for students to almost go into this oral stage of reading, meaning they listen to audiobooks, and they would rather do that. And maybe I mentioned this before, but they'll listen to the book that they're assigned, and maybe they'll read along, but probably they won't. And they'll speed it up to 1.5 or even 2. And so it's going very quickly. They're getting through it, but they're once again losing those decoding skills in the process.
And what we see with history, though, is that they do the same thing with, as far as assignments on what they're supposed to read with regards to history. For them, reading is going from word to word to word until they get to the last period. And then they decide, well, that's it. I'm done. I've got it. But you ask them the slightest of questions. They dig even a couple inches deep, and they really have not taken in the book in that way. And for me, whether it's free range choice or whether it's forced upon them, even if they don't like the book, I think there's something to be gained from that. And the thing I think about is A Catcher in the Rye. It was a book I was required to read in high school.
We all read it.
I all read it. I didn't like it. I said, "Why is this kid cussing so much?" At this,
This book is lousy, you said.
yeah. So, and this coming from a guy who does curse, but I mean, I was like, why so much? And I didn't understand standing on the. I mean, I could understand standing on the edge of a cliff, making sure none of the kids go over. I could understand the kind of the imagery there, but I was left more frustrated with that book than edified by it. But at the same time, looking back on it, I think there is a value to engaging in text that maybe you would not have normally gone to, and that even in a book perhaps that you don't like in total, that there is something that can be gleaned from it, that there's something that can be used by you, and how you go about anything else. And so, whether you're forced to read a book or you read it on your own choice, I think the chance of enrichment still plays a role.
I do remember those. My English teacher was very excited about Catcher in the Rye,
Mhm.
and the English teachers, have an incredibly important role because if they're just, going through the motions, they have to sell it in some ways. And, it's just the way it is. But some are really great at that.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking back to what I said earlier about rereading, and Steve, you were talking about sort of moving through the text and not really understanding it.
Right.
Like, I think that rereading is in one way one of the highest pleasures that you can have as a reader, because you're reading in greater depth. But then I was thinking, yeah, as a study skill, it's actually like the worst study skill there is.
What do you mean?
Like there's this great book called Make It Stick
Yeah.
that makes this argument about rereading being the most common and the least effective study skill.
Wow.
So when you're talking about informational texts or textbooks or things like that, what do students always do? They said, "Oh, I studied for hours. I reread all my notes." Or I reread the chapters, you know. And what they mean is I moved my eyes over the page, and on the test, if the information is asked in a way that's slightly different than the way it was presented, then I'll be completely lost. And so there's also like accompanied with reading is writing, right? So, the ability to create something new, maybe map it out in a different way or restate the information that you're studying, uh, helps with retention, and that's certainly not the only thing we're aiming for with our reading, but it is something that's part of, students' lives anyway. So.
I'm reading a rather difficult philosophical text. I have a monthly reading group with some professor types, and actually, it's really enjoyable because everybody brings something to the table, and sometimes we read each other's work. Um, but I found that I couldn't just read it in the traditional way. And so I decided to do what I always do because I do a lot of editing, constantly for my dissertation students, but the same methodology where I'm reading it in a Word document and I'm not editing it. I mean, it's a great text, but I'm using the margin, to write my thoughts, to summarize. And I found that if there are terms, and you run into those all the time in philosophical texts that I don't know, I'll look it up and put that in a note too. And then suddenly I'm really active, but the best part is when I'm typing my thoughts. And I think that's, the only way, because it's like reading Kant or something just straight through. You're probably, it's not going to register. And you read it twice, just like you said, nothing will change.
And this is the issue when you ask students to read history, or you ask students to read, something, you tell them the idea about active reading as opposed to passive reading, which a lot of the kiddos do. You tell them about the idea that, you can expand your understanding of the text by writing on it, and writing, either in the book itself or writing, notes off to the side. But for some of them, the objective is not to understand, but simply get through it. And so for those kiddos, you know, they don't want to hear, take some notes onto the side, ask yourself some questions, because that prolongs the misery that they think that they're trying to avoid. And you talked about the fact that, some kids don't have the ability to read anymore. They don't have the attention span. They don't have the approach correct. And that's always going to be the challenge. I've read somewhere we're teaching our kids to read, but we're not teaching them how to love to read. And that there is something there that's missing in how we approach it. The English teachers love to read, but it's hard to get that across.
Ross, tell me what you think of this. I remember a time when I was ahead of school and I had a teacher who she was having trouble getting her students to read the history textbook well.
Mm.
And so I gave her like she had a like an abridged version of the textbook. It was one of these like trimmed down Western Civ textbooks where they had, it was in its seventh edition or something, and they had like trimmed it down and trimmed it down for the modern student, But I had an older version, that was thicker and had more information. And she read that, and I kind of gave it to her as you could use this to help prep your lectures and kind of thing. But she ended up giving that to her students, and they liked it more
Wow.
because, especially with history narratives, if you're just talking in isms and like this movement and that movement and this thing happened, and you can trim it down so much that there's no life left in it. There's no details, and it's just totally boring. And so paradoxically, the the fuller that narrative is, and the more like kids will actually read more pages to get that rather than have to read, fewer pages, but a kind of just stultified version of it. So I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but that was my experience.
I think you've hit the nail on the head because, we talked about the fact that in our attempt to try to boil down everything to its lowest common denominator and its most broadly applied aspects, i.e., for testing, that both curriculum but also reading has been boiled down as well. And pretty soon we're going in the direction, in Japan, their history textbooks are basically nothing more than elaborate timelines.
Mm-hmm.
And you lose everything, not least of which the interest, not least of which is the context. And I can see a kid gravitating towards something like that, like you suggested, because finally you have some meat on the bones. Now you finally have something you can kind of latch onto. Now you have something that perhaps in going deeper into the context or the reasonings or the consequences, you tap into something that maybe the kid better understands. Maybe they have a personal experience. Maybe they have some sort of familial connection or just the ideas or the emotions or the motivations they have an understanding of better if there's more there to latch onto.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that works in the English classroom too, right? Like, so this is where writing is really important. Um, so I used to tell my students about, like imagine the way that, Kobe Bryant watched film of Michael Jordan, for example, right? Like, how do you think he watched those, game sevens that he was, had on record? What was he thinking about? What was he watching? He wasn't just watching the game excited like any old fan. He was thinking about what he would do in that situation and noticing every little thing that Michael was doing and all of his technique, right? And so like reading for enjoyment is great, reading for analysis is great, but also like reading so that you can figure out what is the craft that this author is employing so that I can do it too. So there's that imitative aspect of it. One of my colleagues here at the University of Dallas wrote a book called The Writer's Workshop, and he has all of these little exercises in it about uh, take this line from Melville, say, and put it in the style of I don't know, Hawthorne or something, uh, or write an imitation of this like Chaucerian poem, but about something else. And so when you have students engage in that imitative activity or that work of craftsmanship themselves, then they start reading in such a way that it's like they're getting ideas for their own poems or for their own stories, which I think that can be really neat.
Think about imitative. I'll think about how chess players will sometimes read and study
Mhm.
what people have done in similar games and what have you, and they study different methods. They study how someone played this particular person or that particular person. And while in the onset, it may seem like a kind of a rote type of exercise, and perhaps it is, there's a philosophy behind it, and there is there's different ways of looking at this a similar problem, and in the grand scheme of things, it can create a pretty diverse way of thinking.
So
Yeah.
the concept of writing and reading and pairing them um, seems to give a lot of success. And I just wanted to ask Paul about the something that should be more appealing to students, but it doesn't seem to be, is poetry because it is relatively short. You say as much as possible with the fewest words, and every word is chosen. And I would think that that would appeal to high school students. And I'm hearing people say that they don't like the poems. How do you address that?
Well, yeah, I think that poetry can be hard for students because they feel a bit intimidated by it, and they feel as though they're supposed to get it. Like it's a puzzle that has one answer or a lock that if they just, say the right thing, then they'll have understood it the way that you understand the solution to a math problem or something like that. Um, but I think that poetry can be, of course, one of the greatest pleasures of reading and of writing, um, because it's so concentrated and so distilled down and so intense. Um, and I think it's just a matter of helping the students understand that every little thing matters in a poem, whether it's the form or the meter or the rhyme or the denotation or connotation of a word or yeah, syntactical features, rhetorical features, and they may not have the right away, like the terminology for that, the technical vocabulary for it, but they can acquire that, and then what they'll see is that itself becomes something that's played upon in the poem. Um, so so yeah, I think I would call that close reading, and it's something that you can do very well with a limited section of text. You were talking about the Grapes of Wrath earlier, and just like
Mm.
pulling out a moment
Yeah.
and reading that very closely. Uh, you can actually do that close reading and see the whole of the thing. Like the close reading can be a holistic reading with a lyric poem in most cases. Unless you're talking about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner or something like that.
It is fascinating. I think sometimes you can compare poetry with art in the sense that, depending upon where it comes from, what country it comes from, what time period it comes from, that much of art and much of poetry is to the modern reader code. And maybe they don't have the connection to the code that was used at the time. Maybe it would have been very well understood at the time, but perhaps further on down the road, it makes it a little bit harder. But I think going to what you were saying earlier, Paul, I think there is also just a general attitude that some kids feel like that if they don't get it right away, then it's not worth their time, or they can't do it, or whatever the case may be. They think they should be able to tap into the essence of something immediately.
Mhm.
And this takes us back to once more our idea about rereading books. It doesn't always hit the first time.
That's right. And sometimes you sort of have to wait and sit with something, So I was thinking about the difference between, say, trying to interpret or read a lyric poem versus reading a work of visual art, like a painting in a museum or something. And then also say a symphony or something like that. Well, the difference between the painting and the symphony or the poem is that you can you can take visual art in all at once. yes, your eye moves around the painting. That's true. And you can focus in on one part or another. But in general, you're beholding the whole thing all at once. Whereas with reading, you're reading one part and then another part and then another part. It's sequential. And then, of course, the same with music. And so the challenge is to sit with a poem or a novel or a short story long enough and to retain it in memory sufficiently enough so that you can behold all of it at once. That's easier to do, I would say. Um, well, it's more straightforward, yeah, with a painting. Um, and maybe the challenge with a painting is something like attending to the details after you've beheld the whole, right? Um, but that part whole correspondence thing is really important for reading, I think, as well as just the discipline of uh, 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 having a sufficient attention span
Yeah.
such that you can appreciate it.
Yeah.
Right. And, you can develop that through the activity of doing it.
So I want to go back to high school. I mean, not literally, that would be a terrible thing to do.
Very
Um,
terrible.
None of us want that. Yeah.
Upon a little more reflection, kind of underselling, I'm presenting myself as some jock who's just interested in sports and rock and roll or whatever. But I do recall, I think in my sophomore year, that I was very literate in music and classical music particularly, and I would listen to Beethoven particularly, and I wanted to know about his Ninth Symphony because the fourth movement has a text by Schiller, the German poet. And so I made sure, that's one of the reasons that I studied German, is I wanted to understand that poem, and and the depth of that piece of music when you understand the text, it's incomparable. You can't really get what I mean. You have a feeling, this incredible structure that you don't really know until you read the poem as a poem, and then you put them together, and you have this, what do you call it, a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art together. So I think I did kind of go down that that path earlier, on the German side, but that was a big influence, just that exercise. And it was a bad answer when people, they would always ask you, why are you studying German? And people would say, I have a grandmother who's German. I want to learn about German food. And I'd say, I wanted to understand Schiller. And they said, what a weirdo.
But that's a beautiful thing when you encounter someone in your reading who is also like you encounter them encountering someone else. Right? Like, so this happens all throughout the tradition, right? Like, Virgil, when you're reading Virgil's Aeneid, you're also reading Virgil's reading of Homer, and then sure enough, Virgil shows up again in Dante's Divine Comedy, right? And so now you're reading Dante's reading of Virgil, who was reading Homer, right? Or, it's just happens all over the place. Like, when you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's helpful to have also read Milton's Paradise Lost, which features in that story. And so there are all these sort of intertextual moments and commentaries, in the same way that in any art, right? Like, a jazz musician is going to be invoking the riffs and the sequences of various influences, right? And that same thing happens in a literary way.
Yeah, it does. Put the onus on the individual to choose the right subtext, to choose the right, connective tissue. Can't go to India and then read Eat, Pray, Love and think you're going to get a deeper experience out of India, but, but when I went to Iceland, I read the sagas, and all of a sudden things made sense. The road signs made sense. The name of the streets made sense. You look at the way that the country developed, that starts to make sense. And so if you make the right connection, if you choose the right source, it can be, and maybe it's better that people didn't get your connection with Beethoven, because that's what makes it special. That's what makes it special for the individual, is that it's not something that's widely seen, held, or understood. And that makes it more richer for the individual to experience it.
Well, to return to the other question that both of you responded, I prefer the sound of being alone more, and I did profoundly as a, young person, particularly in high school. And I was locked literally in a practice room for 4 hours a day throughout high school. So you learn that to appreciate that. And if there's another person in the room, there are three of you because you're having this lively inner monologue. So, but I think it's a good topic. I was incredulous when you introduced it. I thought, well, what are we going to do with this? And then Paul liked it immediately when we pitched it to him, and I thought, okay, there may be something there. But
that's a true intellect right there. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah. Well,
can't compare yourself to him.
come on, man. I'm like 100 years old.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful that people listened to this episode. Congratulations, as Rich Eisen said, you made it to the end.
Oh,
Well done. But it also highlights the fun part about doing this, and that's getting to speak to smart people.
Oh,
certainly the University of Dallas treasures you, and so do we. And so we really appreciate you jumping on with us.
Absolutely, guys. This was really fun. Let's do it again.
All right.
We'll do it really soon, and please share this episode with everyone who loves you.
Yeah, I'll share it out for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, with that, we shall say adieu, Herr Dr. Weinhold, Herr Dr. Bourgeois, and to you later.
Auf Wiedersehen.